All right, so we're back here, and last time, as you remember, we made our mutation that was doing the create level, and we just had a placeholder for this initially, if you recall. And if we look at that, all it did is just return null, which is not really that exciting. What we'd like to do is create this level now in our SQL database. Well, as it happens, it's relatively easy to do that. We can use our new level by just creating a level using the exact parameters that are passed in. Because what Sequelize will do is when you do a create, it will actually just fill in the, it'll try to match using the model file that we have. It'll try to match up the names of our fields here in our model with the data that's passed in through our through the create. And since we've named these things the same thing as we named our GraphQL schema, we really should just be able to pass this in directly. Now, you may be thinking, hey, wait a second. In our new level data, we have nested information. We have those sheep, we have dogs, we have exits, all these objects that are not part of that main level object in the model. Turns out that's okay, because very conveniently, Sequelize will just ignore everything that's not actually there. So let's kind of see what this looks like. We're going to set a breakpoint here, and yeah, let's run it and see what this does. So before we do it, let's take a look at where we're at right now in our SQL. And as you can see, let me refresh this here, make sure we got the latest. Yeah, so right now we have these two levels. And if our create actually works, we should get another level out of this. Let's see, shall we? Let's go to our GraphQL. And first we'll query the levels. It's always good to make sure the server's still running. We can see our two levels. And now let's create a new one. And we'll just use the same code we had from before, where we're creating a level that has one sheep and an exit. And that's pretty much it. Let's do it. So now you can see that it executed correctly. We have our level object here. It looks pretty good. All that good stuff that we told it. Let's go take a peek at the SQL. And we can see that, oh yes, great. We have our width, our height. We don't have an exit ID. That's because we haven't parsed that nested object. And everything else looks good. So that looks great. Let's continue on. Past this breakpoint. And we don't really need that breakpoint anymore, so I'll take it out. And let's look here. And what we got is, remember when we created this, we only asked for the ID back, and it gave us that ID. If we go query the levels now, we get this bad guy. Now, you'll notice that it didn't return any sheep because we didn't have the code to create those sheep. You also notice that we didn't create an exit. And technically, if we look back at our schema, the exit is required. So why didn't it give us an error? Well, GraphQL, it only looks at stuff that you told it to look at. This is a cool part of GraphQL. Now, if I actually told it to get the levels out of here, instead I wanted the xloc and zloc of each level, now I'm going to get an error because it says, hey, for that level, we don't have this. We got a null, and this cannot be null based on our schema. So, something to keep in mind. So, with that, let's go in and delete that thing that we made, first of all, just so we don't have invalid data hanging out. And now we're back to our 2 functioning levels. Great. And now let's talk about how we might create this. So what we can see here is when we make our level, we can't just make the level. We also have to make these sub-objects. So how do we go about doing that? Well, you basically do it the exact same way. So we know it has to have an exit. So we can say, first we're going to add the exit. We know it has to have sheep. So we add the sheep. And then we have all the other things that we could, in theory, add in here. And just to remind ourselves, let's pull our schema over here. And we can see that in addition to the sheep and the exit that are required, we can also have fences, electric fences, bushes, puddles, mud puddles, holes, dogs, and stars. For all these, we're only going to add them if, of course, they exist. So if the new level data has fences, then we're going to add fences. And do the same thing for each of these things. I had to look over there for a second to see what I call this. Capitalization, all that stuff is very important. All right, so we're going to go through and do this. And basically, for each of these things, we're going to follow the same basic construct. We're first going to create an object. And then we're going to pass in the subset of data. Now, a couple things you'll note here. When I create this, could just use this particular data here, the new level data, but we're going to have a bit of an issue because part of the thing that I need to have in my level data is going to be the ID of the level that I'm trying to add in, right? So if you remember my database, when I had these things, stars, so on, they all need a level ID. And the level ID is not part of the schema, but we're going to need it. So I have to kind of add that in order to make that work. So a couple things I can do. One is it's JavaScript, so I can just add that in right there. And then this thing should have the level ID. If I wanted to, I could also build this object here myself by parsing it. We're not going to do that now. We don't really need to. You also notice I don't bother awaiting for the return of this level because I'm going to need to read this data. I have to actually get the ID out of it. but I don't actually need to wait for this thing to end. It's totally fine if it just stays there. So the sheep, kind of going to work the same way, except we have multiple sheep. So I'm going to say I'm going to do the same thing. Going to add in that level ID, and then I'm going to create it. Just like that. And this is basically the form that we're going to follow for every other type of object here. Now, one thing that we want to check, because I can never remember, what is the correct iterator here? Is it in or is it of? Let's just assume for now that it's in, but if we didn't remember, what I do frequently is just take a look and be like, versus for of. Kind of handy. So we kind of cruise over these things to kind of remember which one is which. So I look at for in. For in iterates over the properties of an object. That does not sound like what we want at all. Let's look at for of. For of, but iterate over iterable objects like arrays or strings. Well, that seems like what we want. So now that we've clarified that for us, we can use this in the right way. And, oops. We have our fences. Let's do electric fences. We can conveniently keep our fence word. We just paste all these here just to kind of keep things going. I'm going to save the holes for the end, and I think you can guess why, because that was a little more complicated form. But with that, So we've created all those, and now we just need to do the holes. So remember, the rabbit hole was actually two different objects here. So we have to deal with both of those objects. If we looked at our thing for getting the holes, what we do is we're going to fetch those things out. You know, this makes me feel like, because this object is so simple, we really could just do it a little bit differently here. And instead of having the entry hole and the exit hole, because the holes really only have a location, we might just want to like change this a bit. Have these entry tables here. And then we don't have to do anything special. We would just parse this. Now we can have this SQL data be in a different format than the schema. It's fine, because when we fetch this, we're going to get the rabbit hole here, and here we can actually transform that object. So I could say this is rabbit hole data. We're going to just kind of transform this. Make an empty array here. This is going to fetch this data from here, and we're just going to create this. And if we look at our schema was really the thing that's splitting these into different objects here. We don't really need to do this ourselves. So if I look at what we were doing for the rabbit hole, we basically just had two entry hole and an exit hole. All right, so now we're recreating those data objects, and I can say data values is the internal pointer to this. And so I can say something like that. Basically, we're recreating this object structure from this flat list. It's kind of handy because we know exactly how many holes there are. All right, so after that brief detour, let's go back to our holes here. And now it's going to work out more or less the same way, but in reverse. So in addition to saying the level ID, I'm going to say first, we really should fix this. Okay, so the xlog entry here will be our new level data that we're passing in. Actually, we'll just take curl. We already have that. All right, so I've unwound that and we're storing it back in there. And that should really be all we need to make it work. Let's make sure we save that. And make sure we're running here. In another episode, we'll show how you can kind of keep this thing running at all times. Oh, hole is not defined, because I deleted it. Yep, someone's dog looks like they're having a good time. All right, let's try it out. So now, if I go here and I create this level again with my sheep, and an exit, we should actually get some results. So let's take a quick peek at the SQL and we'll look at our sheep object here. Let's delete this query and just get all the sheep. So right now we have 4 sheep. And let's look at the exits. Did we make an exit object? I don't remember anymore. Oh, I think we just called them single objects. Oh, don't have anything there yet. Oh, here they are. Up at the top. There we go. Okay, so there's exit objects. Okay, let's go here and create something. We're going to create a level. We're going to give it 1 sheep and 1 exit. Let's see what happens. It said it created it, ID 4. Well, let's see if we see anything in the database. Well, we have an exit object. Looks like it's good. It has the parameters that we gave it. 10, 0 with an angle of 30. Great. Let's look at our sheep objects. Also good, we have our new sheep at 0, 0 for 4. Awesome. And we have our new level, hopefully, also ID 4, test level. Looking good. Let's see if we can actually query it. Let's go back to our levels here. Make sure the sheep are working and the exit is working. See how we're doing. Oh, cannot return nil for field single object dot xlog. Well, do we think that we're missing it from the sheep or the exit? Nice thing with GraphQL, we can remove part of the query and be, oh, look at this. Our sheep is working for test level. Let's pull the ID here too, so we can always be sure what level we're talking about. So we can see this, but something happened with our exit. Let's go take a look. So when I get the level, exit object, find all. This is very interesting. So here we're saying find all, but you know what? We aren't really finding all because there's only one exit. So this is going to return an array, I suspect is the problem, when we actually want it to return a single object. Let's take a peek and see if that's the case. We'll put our exit back in. And see how it's querying. And look at that. We have an array. It's an array of 0, so that's not good. Well, that's number 1. But basically, we're definitely returning an array here. Let's go to until we see our exit off of ID 4. Okay. What we really want to do here is to say find 1. I think that will work better. To make it more clear, we'll just call this one exit object. I put the object in there because exit is normally a word that you don't want to use in the programming language. A lot of languages, exit has a particular meaning. So, not great. All right, with that, let us continue. All right, and now we have our exit null. Looking good, exit null. For level 4, we actually have an exit. So now it's returning the right data, but we're still going to have a problem because this actually is not supposed to be nullable. And we didn't make any exits for those other 2. Let's go into our database here and make a couple more exits, shall we? For our other 2 poor levels that currently have no exits. All right. Now everybody should have an exit. And we're fetching our exits correctly. So there we go. We have our create level. We can certainly test this, and we definitely do want to test every single property here and make sure they're all working. But we can leave that as an exercise to you, the reader, or just trust me that I will do it in my spare time. And yeah, that's pretty much it for today. Next thing we're going to do is connect this back into our game, and we're going to start loading levels from the game and creating them in GraphQL and loading them in from the game. And then we'll go and make our level editor in the game, which will be the last step to make this an actual cool, useful thing. Thanks a lot.